I want to say again, welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here, and thank you to those of you who are tuning in online. St. Michaelites, you may or may not know this, but there are several churches across the country who are using this class as their adult Sunday formation as well. So it's a real privilege to be able to be with you all here in person and with our friends digitally across the country. We're going to begin today. You can't hear me. I cannot do anything about that, but hopefully our crack team can. And it will help, I think, once everybody's in and settled and the doors are closed as well. We're going to begin in Genesis chapter 12 this morning. And let me start with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the opportunity you've given each and every one of us to engage with you in your story. Thank you that your story informs our story. Help us during this time to read, to learn, to mark, and to inwardly digest your holy words to us. Help us to know you better so that we may better know ourselves. We pray all these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen. All right, so this is the third week of God's story. We have been through the stories of creation and Genesis 1 through 4 in the garden. We have been through the narrative of the flood. And today, we are entering into the Abrahamic cycle, which, if I can just sort of say, everything that's come before this is prelude, because Abraham is the father not only of our faith, but of all monotheistic faiths. So if you have Jewish or Islamic brothers and sisters or friends in the world, Abraham is the person that we all look back to as the pioneer of our faith. So beginning in chapter 12, we're going to go through this together. If you all have questions throughout, I know it's very difficult to ask questions among this many people. Feel free to come up and maybe stand here if you want to ask a question. You can raise your hand when I ask for that as well. And I just want to let you all know that we're working on a solution for people to be able to ask us questions sort of in real time, and so look forward to that in the next few weeks. So in Genesis chapter 12 begins with these words. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you may be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is the first time since God and Noah have had their conversations that God has spoken to humanity. And it's a very familiar kind of conversation. And God says, "Go." And Abram says, "Okay." The next line, so Abram went. And the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran, which is the place that they are. I don't know how good your geography is. We'll do our best. In the land of the Chaldeans, Babylon, modern-day Iraq, the two great rivers where we've been throughout Genesis this far, creation and the flood. Haran is the topmost part of that. And Abram's going to leave from that place and go down into a couple of different stops before he settles. You'll notice that in that very first promise to Abraham that I read, Abram is 75, there's no mention of any children. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Go to the land that I will show you. That's all we've gotten so far. You're going to remember that God's going to have some other promises to Abraham as we go through. So let's go down to verse 7 of chapter 12. Abraham is on his journey. He stops at a couple different places, makes altars to the Lord, and God speaks to him. And then in verse 7, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So that's the beginning of the offspring portion. You might know at this part of the story that Abram and his wife Sarai have no children. It's going to be a major theme that's got to be taken care of here in a bit. So he continues his journey south. Thank you. I appreciate the laughter. Laughter is good and important. And I'm going to start in verse 10, because this is a part that I think we miss a lot, and it's very important. Verse 10 of chapter 12. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter into Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarai, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and if the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say that you are my sister, so that it may go well for me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. So they go into Egypt, and Sarah says, I'm his sister, and then she gets taken into Pharaoh's household, and that's not good. This not only happens once, but it happens again after this, another story, and it happens in the Isaac and Rebekah cycle as well, this misrepresenting who your wife is. By the way, gentlemen, please don't misrepresent who your wife is. Also, don't marry your half-sister, which is true. His half-sister, yeah, they have the same mother but a different father. It was a different time. We'll just leave it at that. But where do they go? They go into Egypt. This is significant. This is not the first appearance of Egypt in the Bible. There's a very brief passage when one of the sons of Noah has a son whose name is Egypt and settles in Egypt. Pharaoh is going to come up. So what happens when Abram's wife Sarah is in Pharaoh's household is that God visits Pharaoh with plagues. Does that sound familiar? When we get to the book of Exodus, we're going to hear about, right, the 10 plagues that God visits upon Pharaoh in order for his people to be set free. Well, it does work out well for Abraham. He gets a bunch of cattle and possessions, and so they leave and they go back up into that promised land. And that's chapter 12, quickly. In chapter 13, Abram and his nephew Lot have so many possessions that they need to divide up. And so Abraham says to his nephew, go pick whichever way you want to go. If you go that way, I'll go this way. If you go this way, I'll go that way. You pick, Lot. So Lot chooses the land that's sort of over by the Jordan, and he settles there. Sodom and Gomorrah are going to come into play really quickly. Those are lands over there. And Abram and all his possessions and people are going to settle elsewhere. So that's kind of what happens here. But we have a second appearance of the covenant in chapter 13, verses 14 through 18. Let me read this to you real quick. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all that the land you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Rise up, walk the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and he built an altar to the Lord. Once Abram and Lot are separated, God tells Abram the extent of the land that his descendants will inherit. But it's not until then. God doesn't reveal the extent of the promised land to Lot. I want to point out a couple other things as we go through. In chapter 14, there's a great battle between a bunch of the kings. If you have a Bible, you can see and read all the names of all the different areas. They all have their own individual kings. And in that big skirmish, Lot is captured. Remember, this is Abram's nephew. And so Abram takes some guys, and they go up and they have a battle, and they defeat all these other guys, and they return kind of the goods to the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot comes back with them. There's a very, very interesting section that we don't want to miss, and that starts in verse 13. The one who had escaped and told him, and after the return from the defeat, verse 17, the kings who were with him, the kings of Sodom, went out to meet at the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. And verse 18 here, King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. This is a super significant portion because this person, Melchizedek, is going to appear much, much later in the Bible, and we're going to hear about Jesus being a priest of God in the order of Melchizedek. It's not someone we hear about again, and this is a really interesting story we should note happens right around Jerusalem. And when Melchizedek comes, he brings bread and wine. He is a priest of God Most High. There is a celebration and a blessing. And then Abram gives him a tithe. He gives him 1/10 of everything that he has just earned or captured. You probably could see some parallels there. You might even hear a stewardship sermon on this passage someday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, Abram still hasn't inherited the land. We still haven't dealt with the child issue. We'll go to chapter 15. The question of inheritance is going to come up. God, a servant in my household, Eleazar, is going to inherit all my things. You made this promise to me back when I was 75. Here we are years later. God says, no, I promise you're going to have descendants. Sarah gets impatient in chapter 16, and down while they were in Egypt, she picked up a servant named Hagar, happens to be Egyptian. That's not a coincidence. It's pretty important, actually. And so Sarah says, you know what, Abram, it's not working for me. I'm probably past that age, so why don't you take Hagar and make a child with her, and I'll raise it like it's my own. And so Abram's a dumb guy, and he says, okay. And so they have a child. He's 86 at this time in his life, and he has a son named Ishmael. Ishmael's going to be a very important figure for a lot of us and a lot of our friends. As soon as Hagar becomes pregnant, Sarah gets jealous. Who could see that coming? And so she casts her out. And she goes away. An angel of the Lord appears to her and says, no, go back. This is all going to work out okay. So she comes back. In chapter 17, we have the next version of the covenant between God and Abram, the changing of the names from Abram to Abraham, from Sarai to Sarah. Abram is 99 when this covenant has happened. Okay, 99. It's important. How old was he just a minute ago when Ishmael was born? 86. So how old is Ishmael? 13. So when you have a teenager, perhaps it's time to wish to start over because it's not working. Yes, all right. So I'm going to start in chapter 17 really quick, and we go through the covenant. We just talked about that. The next version of the covenant includes circumcision. It does come from back in, but we're going to look at this later. What makes Abraham a man of faith is not the circumcision. It's back when we started in chapter 12, and God said, go, and Abram said, okay. All right, so we'll point that out. Chapter 18, this is one of my favorite passages. The Lord appears to Abram by the oaks of Mamre where he set up his tent, Hebron. By the way, that's where their graves are today. You can go and visit them. Abram looks up and he sees 3 men. The Lord appears to him by the occurrence of 3 men, and there's some great artwork, iconography that's associated with this passage. We don't know if they're angels, but they're certainly divine messengers. They're kind of other. And he appears, and what's really significant in chapter 18 is what Abram does. He looks up, he sees them, he runs to greet them, and he says, if I can find favor with you, please come and stay with me. He gets water for them to refresh themselves, and then he asks Sarah to make bread, and they kill the calf, and he feeds them. You can't emphasize this enough, this idea that hospitality is the most important thing in the ancient Near East and in that part of the world today. If you go to the land of the Holy One and you interact with people who are strangers, the most important thing to them is how they are hospitable to you. We can learn a lot from them. If you come on Thursday this week into the chapel at 11 o'clock, or you want to tune in later, we're going to pick up the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and learn about their fate and how it relates to this concept of hospitality. So there's a little plug. So that is chapter 18. Now we're going to skip a few chapters and go into chapter 21. While those angels of the Lord, those men of the Lord are there, they say again, I know you're 99, Abram, and your wife is barren. She's past that age where she can give child. But she's going to have a child, and she laughs. And Abram had laughed earlier, and that's okay. And she denies that she laughs. That's not so okay, but whatever. And then, you did laugh? No, I didn't. Yes, you did. Anyway, all that's in there. But what's important about all of this is that she does have a son, and his name is Laughter, Isaac. And so God's promises do come true. So starting in chapter 21, I'm going to read you a little bit about what happens. So now Abram is 100. Okay, Abraham is 100, and Sarah is older. And so how old is Ishmael if Abraham's 100? 14, good, you're with me? Fantastic. All right, I'm going to go to verse 9. Verse 8, chapter 21. The child grew and was weaned, and Abram made a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. Mothers, you can remember, fathers, maybe we can, what age children might have been weaned back then. It's probably older than a year. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abram, playing with her son Isaac. And so she came to Abram and said, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abram, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. And as for the son of this slave woman, I will make him a great nation because he is your offspring." And so the story continues that Abraham then dismisses Hagar and his son, Ishmael, to go away. Now, how old is Ishmael? All right, now listen, here's verse 15. Here's verse 14. I'll keep going. So Abram rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent them away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bowshot, for she said, "Do not let me look upon the death of my child." And so she weeps, and God hears her, and an angel comes to her and promises that they will be with him. Kind of an interesting little bit of story. If we can remember that in the previous version, Ishmael's 14 at this point, it's kind of hard to imagine her carrying him on his shoulder and also putting him under a bush and then going away. I just want to point that out. It's kind of an interesting quirk of this story, but it helps us to remember that we're dealing with different sources that have come together here. I mean, that's one of the clues, right? So if in one story we have a child playing with a child, then that tells us something. And actually, what's interesting is what upsets Sarah is that Ishmael makes his brother Isaac laugh. That's what the Hebrew says. This laughter is there over and over again, right? He's laughter for her, all those kinds of things over and over. This is all significant because when we get to chapter 22, for us and for our Jewish brothers and sisters, we have what's called the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac. God says, "Take your son, your one and only son." Wait a minute. He had two. He just sent one of them away, right? For our Muslim brothers and sisters, the character that Abram takes in this story, in their version of this, is Ishmael. So the sacrifice of Isaac as we know it, I want to point that out just because it's an interesting parallel. It's a different understanding, but you can see how Abraham and how Ishmael become so important. God says he's going to be the head of great nation and all those kinds of things. So we shouldn't be surprised that today we continue to see that in our world. Chapter 22 is a very disturbing chapter. Why would God ask Abram after all that he's been through, after now he's 100 years old, after his son is growing up, now God says, "Please take your son to the place where I'm going to show you and offer him as a sacrifice to me." This is to test Abram's faith. And all I can say is it's a really horrible, terrible story. But it gives us an insight of God's love for us, because ultimately we know God's love through Jesus Christ, and God gave his own son for us to die on the cross. What happens in the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac, is, and there's clues along the way, Abraham will say things like to the two guys that are coming with him, "Stay here, and we will go and worship, and we will return." So perhaps Abram knows all along what's going to happen. They get up to the top, the altar's prepared, the sacrifice is about to happen, and God provides a lamb. The angel of the Lord speaks, and the covenant is renewed once more. I'm going to pause there for half a second. There's a lot more in the Abraham story. This week, because we're doing Abraham, and next week, we have got to get to Joseph. There's a lot that happens in between. Abram has a son named Isaac who marries Rebekah. They have two sons, Jacob and Esau. And chapters 22 and 23 just have a little bit of that story, which we're going to talk about today. Very briefly, we see the parallel stories with Isaac and Rebekah. Barrenness is going to come up in every generation, these first couple generations, barrenness of the promised wife. And we're going to see some other parallels in their journey. I mentioned that story about lying about who your wife was. That's going to happen again. Until we get to next week and Joseph. Now, Jacob and Esau are an interesting story because beginning with Abram, we begin to see the importance of the firstborn son, that they're going to be the ones to inherit everything from their fathers. And so Jacob and Esau are an interesting story in that Esau is born, and he looks a little different than his brother. His father loves him very much, but his mother loves his brother, and there's this great trickery that happens, and Jacob is going to basically pretend to be his brother and steal his birthright. If you want to flip over to chapter 32, if you've got a Bible handy, after kind of all that's happened, Jacob has left and gone to work for Laban and has earned 2 wives by working 14 years. It's a fascinating and confusing story. He's working for one wife, and then he's given the other sister. Every groom's true hope is that the other sister will be there. It's all about the veil, But he's been away from his brother. He's stolen his birthright. He earns all this stuff. God is very faithful to Jacob, even in his trickery. And in chapter 32, he is preparing to meet his brother Esau, and he's very afraid. And right before he meets his brother, he is going to have this encounter with God. So I'm going to start in verse 25. When the man saw, this is another angelic figure, that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Jacob says, "Tell me your name." But he says, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed him. So there's no name given, but Jacob's response is, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." So Jacob, this great trickster, wrestles with God. He has his name changed to Israel, which is significant. By the way, he has 12 sons from 4 different women and a daughter. Terrible story about her. We won't share today. And those 12 sons of those 4 different mothers will be the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So next week we'll begin to see Joseph, one of them, and how we transition into Egypt. I want us to turn into the New Testament to hear a little bit more about Abraham. Today is the day that we want to really focus on him. And so if you do have a Bible handy, I'm going to start in Romans chapter 4. So, New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. If you need help. We're going to have Bibles in here really soon, and I'll tell you page numbers so everybody can look. So the book of Romans is Paul's most robust theology. It's his most developed. It's probably the last thing that Paul wrote. And like all of Paul's letters, it's a fundraising letter. There's a joke, but we'll skip it. We are saved by works. No, that's James we're going to hear today. We are saved by faith. So let me read a few verses of Romans chapter 4 for us, and we'll see what's going on. What do we say that is gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? For if Abram was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. Skip a few verses about circumcision. Paul seems to be obsessed by that. We'll leave that for another time. Verse 13, for the promise that Abraham would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or his descendants through the law. Right? The law hasn't happened yet. We're going to get there in a couple weeks. But through the righteousness of faith. So it is through faith that we can be made right with God. That's the point. And verse 16, this is a significant part of Romans. For this reason, it all depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also those who share in the faith of Abraham. For he is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. The presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Hoping against hope, he believed that he would become the father of many nations. According to what was said, so numerous shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promises of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Therefore his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Paul goes on to say, we live the same way. We live by faith. And if we are faithful in God's promises to us, we will be righteous like Abram. I think the little section in there about the importance of Abram being a father of nations, I can't really overstate, right? Abram's not just our father of faith. He's our Jewish brothers and sisters' father of faith. He's our Muslim brother and sister's father of faith. He is the father of all monotheistic faith, a belief in one true God. So significant for our world today. We have a common ancestor. We have a place that we can begin conversations about faith. And it does not rest in works. It rests in belief and trust. What is faith? Maybe we should turn to Hebrews 11. Conveniently, that's the next chapter, which gives us a definition of faith. So Hebrews is after Paul's letters. We don't know the author exactly. A long time it's been attributed to Paul. I like to think it was written by Priscilla and Aquila. Others will tell you differently. Traveling companions of Paul. But in Hebrews 11, the last chapter that we'll look at today, says this. Now faith, here's the definition. We got it. Is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith, our ancestors received approval. By faith, we understand the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that were not visible. Creation. John 1. Verse 4, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. That one still didn't make any sense. But through this, he received approval as righteousness, God himself giving approval to his gifts. He died, but through his faith, he still speaks. We're still talking about him. Verse 5, by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he did not experience death, and he was not found because God had taken him. We didn't cover that in this class, but we did on Thursdays. Enoch is Noah's great-grandfather, and like Elijah, he never dies. He's taken up into heaven. And so we hear about him here in Hebrews. And then, and without faith, verse 6, it would be impossible to please God, for whoever would approach him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Last week, verse 7, by faith, Noah, warned by God about the events as yet unseen, respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness that is in accordance with faith. What's important about Noah is not that he built an ark. What's important about Noah is he believed God. He had faith, he trusted, and then he acted. Verse 8, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out from a place to receive an inheritance. By faith, he stayed for a time there in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob. For he looked forward to the city that was the foundation. By faith, he received the power of procreation, even though he was old. Sarah herself was barren because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and from this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars in heaven, as innumerable as the grains in the seashore. The story's going to continue on from there and continue to talk about the faith of Abram and how it's foundational to everything that we've read and experienced. I'm going to pause there. We have a few minutes. If there are questions about Abraham or about the passage from Romans or Hebrews that deal with Abraham and faith, y'all have been awesome in listening. I can't believe I made it through all of those chapters. I'm sure I left some things out, but some good material in there. Questions, comments, gripes, grievances, concerns? Yes?
Is there any significance to the name Abraham and Sarah? Adam is man, Eve is woman.
There is, absolutely. Their names have meaning, for sure. I don't know what they are off the top of my head. The question is there significance to the name Abraham or Sarah? Do they have meaning like Adam is from the earth, Adam? It means the same Hebrew word, same Hebrew basis. Absolutely, they have a meaning, and I'm going to look real quick. I'll see if I can find it. I'm not sure that I can, but I will, and I'll let you know. We can post something on our Facebook page or on the website. Pretty much every biblical character that's named, pretty much, that's of significance, has a name. And the one thing that I didn't talk about today, and this is actually really helpful, through these chapters of Genesis, we are given about between half a dozen and a dozen different names for God. So, what is God's name? This is a general question, rhetorical question here. Well, we're going to hear God called El Olam, which means everlasting God. We're going to hear God called El Elyon, Elohim, El, Yahweh, El Shaddai. All of those names appear in these chapters of Genesis. Again, there's different sources that are coming together which have a different understanding, but one of those names is given to God by Hagar, which I think is really interesting in the context of the world today. So God's name, as it's revealed in the book of Genesis, in Exodus, Moses is going to say, who are you? And God's going to say, I am. We're going to have a lot of different names. So all the names do have a significance, and I will get back to you on the significance of specifically Abraham and Sarah. Other questions or comments? Warren. Father of a multitude is the definition of Abraham. Yes, thank you, Google. Sarah is princess. Lovely. There you go. We did it. We did it together. Got a question back here in the back. I can't hear you. Sorry, come up and tell me, and we'll work on that. Other questions on her way? Yes, right here.
Are we as Christians required to accept what is in the Bible as literally true?
Great question. Are we as Christians required to read what's in the Bible as literally true? I think Chris mentioned it. I think he spoke about it this way a couple weeks ago. You all can correct me if you were here. Come up. He said, I don't read the Bible literally, but I read it as literature, right? I'm going to say it a little differently. We as Episcopalians read the Bible seriously. We take the words in here as seriously. They all contain truth. Now, truth and facts can be different things. Just think about our political climate today. What is a fact? Can we agree on it? I don't know. But I think as Christians, we can believe in the truth. There is a God. We're not God. God made us because God is love. God's love is revealed to us through Holy Scripture, and especially in the person of Jesus Christ. So that's what I would say to answer that question. Some of the things that come up in the Bible, like in Leviticus when it calls a bat a bird. A bat is not a bird. A bat is a mammal, right? It gives birth to live young. It nurses its young. Does that mean the Bible is wrong? Or does it mean that human understanding of truth at that time was different than our understanding today? So those are some kind of helpful ways to think through that. Madeline, what was your question?
Okay, I wanted to go back to the ram in the bush story.
Ram in the bush story,
Yes.
Genesis 22, sacrifice of Isaac. Yes.
Yeah, now, my question was, because I'm trying to understand exactly what God's trying to teach me, or He wants me to understand.
Oh, yes.
And He tells Abraham again that He's going to bless him.
Yes.
Is it that Abraham is blocking his blessings? Because He's told him this numerous times.
That's a great question. Thank you, Madeline. I think Madeline's question is, in chapter 22, when God says, sacrifice your son Isaac, and Abram's kind of like, wait, what? You promised me I was going to have all these descendants. We've already sent Ishmael away, and now you're telling me to kill my only son. And God says, yeah, I promise. Even now, you were 100 when that happened. You're even older now. I'm still going to make your name great, and your descendants is numerous. Why? Again, it's such a difficult story for God to ask that. Now, we have to remember the promise, obviously, that God will provide. On that mountain, God does provide the ram. Is it to test Abraham's faith? Perhaps. But for me, I think it's a very helpful to think about it in terms of a precursor for Calvary, about God's going to do through Jesus. And that Abraham was so faithful to God that he wouldn't withhold his son, and God is so faithful to us that God did not withhold his only son. I think that's the important lesson to take away from there. Y'all have been awesome today. I want to say if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to email me. A couple of things just to remind you that we do continue God's story on Thursdays at 11 o'clock in St. Michael's Chapel. All of these classes, of course, videos are available on our website. All of those classes, audio is available. And if you would please, in the next few minutes, kind of clean up your spaces so we can prepare for worship at our 11 o'clock service. Thank you all so much. I'll be with you again next week. I look forward to it.